Let me start with a simple question. At what point does good enough quietly become not good enough anymore? For a lot of growing companies, QuickBooks works until it doesn't. And what makes this tricky is that it rarely breaks in a dramatic way. There's no flashing red light, no system shutdown, no catastrophic failure. Instead, it's slower, subtle, gradual. Month end takes longer, reporting gets messier, inventory doesn't reconcile. Teams build spreadsheets to bridge gaps, and somewhere along the way, finance shifts from strategic oversight to operational survival. But here's the real tension. Most CFOs don't make a change when the strain starts. They tell themselves, we're fine for another year. Welcome back to the Admiral Consulting Group podcast. I'm your host, Mike Lordi, and today we're unpacking that assumption. To break it all down, I'm joined by Dominick, Zappia, and Ben Lane of the Admiral team, who help companies modernize their business every day. Let's dive in. Dominick, welcome.
Mike, how are you?
Very good, sir. In your experience, what's the first thing that actually breaks when a growing company outgrows QuickBooks?
Good question, Mike. I think there's a lot of things, but I think visibility is probably number one, and trust in the numbers as well. So, with QuickBooks, there's a lot of inaccuracy with reporting. Folks are spending a lot of time in Excel. They have system performance issues. The system is slow. But I think the visibility and the trust is really the number one factor, because if you don't trust the numbers, then that's a problem.
Okay. So why do so many finance and operation leaders say, we're fine for another year, even when the strain is obvious?
Well, I think the number one thing is change is an issue. People don't like change until they have to do it. That's probably the number one issue. The other thing is they underestimate the risk of working with a system that is not trustworthy, if you will. They have, working in a lot of different systems. The numbers that they're dealing with are fragmented. So, other things are leadership only sees the high level reporting, the P&L, the income statement, the balance sheet. They don't see all that goes into generating that. That's all done by others in the organization. So they're seeing the final end product and they're not realizing the time and investment going into producing that information. They're just getting it when it's done. So I think that's another reason that people put it off, because they're not the ones dealing with it per se and compiling it all.
So what are the early warning signs that CFOs tend to rationalize or ignore?
Well, if they're doing a lot of journal entries to fix things, that's a problem. Also, they're not, reconciliation of bank accounts, credit cards, that's delayed. So that's another issue, an early warning sign. They're posting things to miscellaneous accounts because the system doesn't have a way for them to really structure a good chart of account or good dimensions. So often what times happens is they start charging things to miscellaneous income accounts and things of that nature. Inventory adjustments are another factor. Not having good inventory numbers. So, they're cleaning up the accounts often. These are just some of the early warning signs. And then also the system itself, the performance of the system, it slows down. As time goes on, QuickBooks will slow down as you put more information and data into it.
Okay, let's move from psychology to economics. We've talked about the mindset, the we're fine narrative, but eventually strain shows up somewhere tangible. It shows up in workarounds, it shows up in spreadsheets, it shows up in operational friction. So let's talk about the real cost of stretch QuickBooks. Ben, how you doing?
Doing great.
All right. This one's for you. How do spreadsheets, bolt-ons, and manual reconciliations quietly become more expensive than implementing a new ERP?
Really, just a lot of it adds up over time. It's delayed a year, or things are familiar and they're working in kind of leadership's eyes, but what they don't recognize or see until it's too late, or it's all finally starting to catch up to them, is all the workarounds the team who's using the product every day has put into place. And so they also assume staying on QuickBooks is saving them money, but after those workarounds start adding up, then you're having to talk to 4 different people or check 4 different systems to decide what inventory number is correct. You're losing trust in that data, and it puts a lot of extra burden on the team to manually have to go through and reconcile and duplicate data entries. And that also leaves room for operational mistakes or, just data entry mistakes. So that's where a lot of the costs are hidden and not necessarily thought of in the process of, okay, when is it time, or when should we move from QuickBooks to an ERP system like Business Central?
Okay, so where does audit risk, reporting risk, or compliant risk, like where does that start creeping in?
A lot of that starts showing up, not because QuickBooks itself is the issue. It's how everyone has had to create those workarounds we've mentioned to essentially be able to function, or their business to be able to function on QuickBooks and between all of these different systems. And so companies start keeping things like revenue schedules in spreadsheets, or inventory adjustments, outside of that core system. And they're in, spreadsheets. There could be one spreadsheet someone's using, another spreadsheet another employee's using, or the warehouse is using one, and CRM's using another one. So there's a lot of manual consolidations and room for, human error with that data entry. And then auditors come in and they say, where is this number from? And the answer, they're never happy with the answer of, oh, we put that in. I entered that in there last week because John told me that's how much inventory we had, or that's who we had to, pay for this invoice. And they don't, and then especially if it's over the threshold of, where they should have gotten an approval. Well, if they're doing that with the spreadsheets, there's really no firm audit trail of who signed off on this, or who requested the approval, who gave the approval, type of thing. And that's really where it gets tricky, and those additional costs come into play from being on that legacy system, when all of a sudden you're spending weeks and weeks and lots of time, lots of effort with those auditors trying to, answer all of their questions and get everything figured out. Whereas in BC, it's all, you pull a report and you can see just about everything you need.
Dominick, Ben touched on multiple systems before. So when data lives in multiple systems, what's the first operational mistake you start seeing? Is it missed orders, incorrect shipments, duplicate entries?
Yeah, I think it depends upon the business that you're in, but using, let's say, an e-commerce or a B2B or B2C company or wholesale distribution company, to your point, you're going to see the missed orders, the incorrect shipments, the duplicate entries. But oftentimes, what happens when you're working with multiple systems, the sales team may be entering an account in CRM, and then finance comes along and they enter the account in QuickBooks. And then they may have entered it differently in each system. So now you just have data sitting, redundancy is this, you have data sitting in 2 different systems, and it doesn't need to be that way. It could just be put it in one system and then it'll go over to the other system. The other thing is data inconsistency. Somebody might put the address in incorrectly. Another thing is orders. Oftentimes they get orders via email, and then those email orders then get picked up by somebody, and then they put it into the system, but they might have put it incorrectly. So if you're using a product like Business Central and you get an email order, that order from email will literally go right into Business Central without anyone having to actually enter it. And it just through AI and such, it'll bring that order over. So you just have, again, it's kind of being redundant, but you just have a lot of inconsistencies. You got too many people touching too many things. There's no one source of truth. And eventually you're going to have issues. You're going to have, again, the missed orders and so forth.
And how often do growing companies discover orders were fulfilled late or shipped to the wrong location because the systems weren't synced?
Well, typically it's going to be, as the company grows, if they're doing 10 orders a day, it's not going to be as prevalent. But, if they're going 100 orders, 200, and they're just growing and growing and growing, and they're seeing more customer complaints, that's when they discover that the orders are being fulfilled late or shipped incorrectly. So, especially too, if they're bringing in orders from an e-commerce site, and those orders have to manually be taken from the e-commerce site to be put into, say, Business Central. That's going to cause errors. Somebody's going to put something in incorrectly. So I think when the customer starts complaining, that's when you're going to really see the issue.
How does excess inventory quietly accumulate when forecasting is happening in spreadsheets instead of inside the system?
Well, again, you have fragmented information. So, somebody's keeping a forecast in a spreadsheet, and then they have to go and upload it to the ERP, which, they may forget to do, or it becomes dependent on manual refreshes. Maybe it's only getting updated on a monthly or weekly basis. So what's going to happen is, you're going to have issues with demand. What demand used to be is not what it actually is, because you're not taking into effect what POs are open, what's in transit, what's already been allocated, maybe to larger accounts. You don't know what's been returned. You don't know, some clients put things in quarantine. So you just have information sitting in the Excel spreadsheet that just, from the forecasting perspective, that isn't in the ERP system. So again, you have that visibility issue.
Ben, in your experience working on the implementation side, what happens when sales is looking at one system, operations at another, and finance a third?
A lot of the things that happen are what Dominick has mentioned with the fragmented data, and also they're all working in maybe 3 different systems, even 4 different systems, or 4 different systems plus a couple spreadsheets. Leads to things like the missed orders he mentioned, incorrect shipments, duplicate invoices, and then also inventory mismatches. Or one of the bigger, most common problems is something referred to as shadow inventory, which is when the warehouse has essentially lost trust in the ERP system, and the numbers that are in there, and no longer finds them reliable. So they start tracking inventory on all of their own little spreadsheets manually. And as soon as that happens, there's really no communication or central source of how much we have of what, and ERP has lost control of the operation, and it's kind of all siloed into different areas, and it leads to more and more disorganization, and additional effort required to really figure out how much we have on hand.
How does lack of centralized data impact customer experience? And what about employee experience?
Lack of centralized data really has kind of that slow building effect, and those workarounds that we've discussed or mentioned a few times in this podcast. So when it exists in 3 different systems, and none of them may necessarily agree with each other or sync with one another, it leads to things like delayed time to shipment, or delayed orders, or even missed orders, or incorrect shipments. Can lead to the shadow inventory situation, where the warehouse knows the system numbers aren't reliable, and this may not be a quick change, but slowly over time they stop trusting it, and all of a sudden they realize they don't trust it at all anymore, and they have everything in their own spreadsheets to track their inventory, where it's going, even production runs and production orders. They're tracking it all in a spreadsheet, and then either manually putting it into a system, day or days later, if at all. And once that happens, essentially you've lost your central source of truth, and there's multiple controls of your operation instead of a single ERP to kind of control and centralize your warehouse and everything you're doing.
QuickBooks doesn't usually fail all at once. It just starts creating friction in reporting, in inventory, in trust. And most companies don't realize they've outgrown it until the drag is already costing them. In part 2, we're going to talk about the tipping point. What actually breaks first when the system can't support the business anymore? Because recognizing the inflection point is one thing, navigating it correctly is another.